Hey, good morning, everybody, and welcome to our webinar on the riparian recommendations from the consultants, Billy Plauché and Peter Dykstra. We'll get started here in a minute. I see folks are still joining. I'll wait for that to slow down here at about 30 seconds or so, and then we'll get started.
Thanks, Mike. It's nice to see you in the facilitator coordinator role and not have to be in that role this morning ourselves.
Yes, I understand that actually. The roles are reversed. Now I get to gavel you down.
That's right.
Do your best.
Just to let folks know, we are recording this webinar. All right, well, looks like it's slowing down now, so we'll go ahead and get started. So last year, the legislature approved funding for consultants to embark on a stakeholder process regarding the riparian buffer bill that was proposed a year or two prior. Folks might remember that effort with the legislature. Representative Lekanoff proposed a buffer bill that sort of stirred the issue, I guess is a diplomatic way of saying it. Landowners and stakeholders from across the state rallied on that bill, and one of the biggest or most significant arguments against it was that there was no stakeholdering done. It was a sweeping, broad bill that had significant impacts on landowners, and there wasn't a lot of stakeholdering done with landowners or any of the stakeholders as well. So the legislature responded and funded a stakeholder process. The consultants were chosen. Billy and Peter are part of that firm, and they've been conducting stakeholder meetings for about the last year and a half. Farm Bureau has participated in those meetings. I came in October, or came on in October, and have attended them since. And we've had a lot of meetings since then, which I've appreciated. We've done several tours, which I think have been most valuable, and then a series of educational meetings teaching us the different aspects of this issue, and then larger roundtable meetings where the entire stakeholder group comes together. The stakeholder group is made up of groups from across the state, tribes, local governments, landowners, maybe others. Maybe Billy and Peter can fill in some of the groups I'm missing. And in fact, we have a roundtable meeting and a tour this coming Monday and Tuesday. But Billy and Peter have released a set of preliminary recommendations. Those recommendations were sent out to the group to review a couple of weeks ago, and I thought it would be important for them to sort of give us an outline of what those recommendations look like, and then be available to answer some questions from members if they have any. So I'll introduce Billy and Peter, and then I'll turn it over to them. I printed out their bios here. I'll read the summarized version of it. Billy provides counsel on legal issues regarding natural resources, land use, and environmental regulations. His experience includes serving as a trial attorney with the U.S. Department of Justice, Environment and Natural Resources Division, Environmental Defense Section. He has appeared before numerous state and federal trial courts and courts of appeal, as well as various Washington state administrative tribunals, including the Growth Management Hearings Board, Pollution Control Hearings Board, the Shorelines Hearings Board, and numerous local government bodies. Peter counsels public and private clients on water rights, land conservation transactions and strategies, ecosystem service markets, and complex natural resource projects. Prior to returning to law practice in 2013, Peter served as Pacific Northwest Regional Director of the Wilderness Society, Washington State Director of the Trust of Public Land, and Managing Director of the Washington Water Trust. Prior to his work in the nonprofit community, Peter spent several years in private law practice in Seattle. He began his career as an Assistant Attorney General for Washington State. So needless to say, both the consultants are highly experienced in this issue area, and well respected too, for that matter. I've worked for both of them for on a number of issues going back several years now. So appreciate their work and on this difficult project. I think they are attempting to thread a needle with very diverse stakeholder groups, and I think doing a pretty good job of it. So Billy and Peter, I'll turn it over to you. Just to give the group a little bit of sense of what we're going to do, we'll have Billy and Peter present for about 20 to 30 minutes, and then we'll open up for Q&A from the audience. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see the Q&A function that should be available for attendees to type questions. Feel free to type your questions in there as we go, and I'll moderate the Q&A once we get to that point. Otherwise, Peter and Billy, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Mike. I'm going to get started and then I'll turn it over to Billy. Thank you for the kind introduction. Thank you for the opportunity to present to all of you today. I'm going to start with a little bit more detail on the background of the process that we've gone through, although Mike gave a wonderful overview, and then turn it over to Billy to dive in the framing of the current preliminary recommendations, where they are, and the work that we'll be doing early next week and through June. So again, thank you. I will say first and foremost, while Billy and I and our colleagues at our firm have been long involved in water, agricultural, land use issues, we were, and we do that both as lawyers and in the policy spectrum, including working occasionally in Olympia. Our firm and the two of us were not directly involved in the Lorraine Loomis conversations. We monitored it for a few of our aquaculture clients, but really we're not involved in that policy discussion in the 2022 legislative session. When the budget proviso was passed at the end of that session, creating the stakeholder process, it authorized the governor's office to hire an independent third-party facilitator. And they reached out to our firm, I think in part because of the history that Mike discussed. A lot of the work that we have been doing on stakeholders from different perspectives here in Washington, in Louisiana, and elsewhere in the country, including having had a long history of working in the Yakima Integrated Plan and some of the other large collaborative efforts between agriculture, local government, tribes, and others. We were asked by the governor's office to consider taking this on. We were very clear that we saw ourselves as independent, neutral facilitator, and although the contracts through the governor's office and funded by the legislature, we were really hired to be independent and work with all of the stakeholders. We did that under one budget proviso through the end of 2022, which the Farm Bureau participated in, and that particular proviso required us to address 6 specific areas. We've published a report that the Farm Bureau has on what Plauché and Carr identified amongst those stakeholder groups as areas for attention around policy recommendations and spending priorities for recovery of salmon and steelhead, with a focus on riparian habitat. We published that report, but it was very clear through that dialogue that the various stakeholders wanted to continue the conversations, and that the 6 areas the legislature had guided the group in were not really where the stakeholder group wanted to focus their conversations. And so there was another budget proviso put forward in the 2023 capital budget to expand and extend that stakeholder conversation. And that's the phase that we are in at this point in time. We got under contract in late summer of 2023 and have had, as Mike said, a series of meetings over the last 9 to 10 months that include 4, and the 5th roundtable meeting is happening next week. We've met 4 times previously. 3 of those 4 times we've been out on the ground. We've been to Wenatchee, Yakima, over to the Olympic Peninsula. We'll be up in Snohomish and Skagit areas this week, and we met one time in Olympia. Each of those meetings, except for the Olympia meeting, involves a half-day field trip where we go out with all of the stakeholder participants who can make the half-day field trip and go out on the ground and look at the challenges that agriculture is facing with any added buffers, where there's been collaboration between agriculture and riparian restoration that's been successful, where there have been efforts that despite good collaboration, projects have not been successful, and exploring the reasons why. All of that to inform the recommendations and really help each stakeholder understand where other stakeholders may be coming from in those conversations. In addition, instead of just meeting 5 times for the roundtable, as Mike said, we've been doing a series of working group meetings where in the beginning it was about education. And as it has grown, it's about sort of evaluating what is emerging as recommendations, getting technical feedback, getting detailed questions answered so we can move some recommendations up to the policymakers at the roundtable to make decisions. Mike has been a great participant. A number of members of the Farm Bureau have been out on field tours and opened their farms and irrigation districts to our tours, and we're deeply appreciative of that. I think the field tour component has really allowed us to really get into the nitty-gritty of some of the challenges in terms of keeping ag viable while also doing effective riparian restoration to recover salmon and steelhead. Where we are headed at this point in time is we have at the end of this month a report due for this second budget proviso. That report will contain a lot of background information as well as a suite of policy and spending recommendations that we have been working hard on with the roundtable and working group participants. We are aspiring to have those recommendations be supported by the groups around the table. It would be great if everyone would support those. And we're working very hard towards finding something that will meet that goal. If we don't get there, we are still obligated to file a report to the legislature on the budget proviso, and we will do so and have all caveats in terms of where there is agreement, where there is disagreement, et cetera. That report is not designed to be legislation. We've been very clear from the very beginning of this process that our work is about providing recommendations, not putting forward any draft legislation from the work that we're doing with the group, or conveying, unless we're clear, what level of agreement we have from the groups. It's really a report about where we are, and that's what we'll put forward at the end of June here. I think we're making good progress in some areas. In other areas, we will be clear that there's not agreement, and we'll articulate that. That doesn't mean that others might not use the recommendations to draft legislation. And so there is, in the current budget starting next year, funding for the stakeholder process to continue and to begin educating legislators on what the group has been doing in participation with a select group of legislators and the participants at the roundtable that we will likely convene as that moves forward. So it's a series of budget provisos that are trying to give us the ability to bring the group of stakeholders together that will hopefully come up with some ideas in terms of spending priorities and policy solutions that can get us to a goal of viable agriculture and improving riparian habitat for salmon and steelhead recovery. Just quickly before I turn it over to Billy, the identified groups that we were instructed by the budget proviso to bring to the table include federally recognized tribes, local governments, agricultural producers, commercial and recreational fisher organizations, business organizations, salmon recovery organizations, forestry and agricultural organizations, and environmental organizations. So that's the full list of the various groups that were identified in the budget proviso. The group that we brought to the table specifically in terms of invitations were a combination of what we had been working with in the first proviso and recommendations from all of the stakeholders around the table of who else could be added. So in 2023 and 24, we've been working with a larger group of people than we were in 2022. Let me stop there and turn it over to Billy.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. That's a great summary of how we got started. Let me start just a little bit on my bio. As you heard from Mike, I've been at this environmental law business for 34 years. My bio that Mike read highlights the first 25 years of my practice, which was a lot of litigation. I did a lot of environmental litigation on behalf of the United States at Department of Justice, and then worked in private practice on behalf of developers, agricultural and industrial users, local governments, again, in litigation. What that taught me over that first 25 years is litigation is not the best way to solve anybody's problem. Somebody wins, somebody loses, usually not both. One party may be ecstatic, the other dissatisfied, and it doesn't often lead to lasting results. So over the last 10 years of my practice, I've really kind of leaned more into this facilitation practice, which Peter's been doing for quite a while as well, which is about bringing kind of disparate stakeholders to the table to see if there is a way to avoid the sort of litigation outcomes and try to work collaboratively on lasting results. So that's so we were excited to be brought into the post-Lorraine Loomis situation here and see if we could make progress with the stakeholders to try to get to some collaborative resolutions. And I do think we're making good progress. I'm going to go over the recommendations from sort of you can read the words on the paper. There's a lot of them in those preliminary recommendations. What I'd like to do today is just spend a little bit of time giving a little bit of a high level kind of summary of those, but really give kind of our perspective on how we landed, where we landed on some of those recommendations. And I'll do that with the strong caveat that what I'll be talking off of now is the preliminary recommendations that we submitted to the governor's office a month ago, pursuant to the legislation. We have that was a very much a preliminary set of recommendations. We are working closely with the roundtable members to refine those recommendations and see if we can get to recommendations that at least some or all of we can get a consensus from the group on. So they're a work in progress. Including we're going to be doing a lot of work on those on Monday and Tuesday, and we probably will have a revised version of these recommendations going to the group late today. So take what I'm about to say kind of in terms of the recommendations as a good framework that I think will hold in a snapshot in time on some of those details. So the recommendations fall into four categories, and there are four categories that are really kind of intertwined and interdependent. It kind of from a broad brush, the first recommendation deals with how to protect existing riparian habitat. The second recommendation deals with how to restore degraded riparian habitat through voluntary programs. The third recommendation deals with what we do in the instances where those voluntary programs aren't meeting kind of agreed upon goals and objectives. And then the fourth recommendation deals with what do we do in the interim while we are developing the program, particularly the program and recommendation 2 around voluntary incentives. What do we do in the interim for riparian protection? So that's kind of the layered approach. It's protect existing, restore degraded. What do you do if you're still not meeting goals? And then what do you do in the interim? With regard to protecting existing function, this is recommendation 1. Recommendation 1, really, it's sort of where you have a fully functioning riparian corridor, protect that riparian corridor. Don't let it be degraded. And where you have a degraded corridor with some functionality, preserve that existing functionality or ensure no net loss of ecosystem function. We don't see this as a change in the law. We see this is sort of the standard under the Growth Management Act, the standard under the Shoreline Management Act of no net loss. And we really see recommendation number one is just bringing riparian protection into that no net loss standard. How is that implemented? Well, first and foremost, we recommend providing some significant funding to local governments, state agencies, to tribes to be able to work on an implementation strategy for this protection standard. We recommend that local governments, state agencies, including the Department of Agriculture, and tribes be brought together to develop guidance on how to implement this kind of riparian protection standard, and that those agencies also provides technical assistance to local governments and to sort of users on the field on how that riparian protection standard is going to be implemented. So fund that effort so that we've got more refined guidance, and then that guidance can be implemented through a lot of technical assistance. We recommend setting a target date for that protection to be put in place. And we also recommend limiting appeals on those comp plans or other development regulations that would implement those protections. That was something that was a strong request from local governments. And then finally, one of the recommendations that we heard over and over again on a lot of our site visits was the challenges with enforcement capacity for non-compliance with existing regulations, just the lack of resources, the lack of tools in the toolbox. And so we've also recommended some significant funding enhancement for compliance monitoring and enforcement, and doing some work around developing strategies and looking at potential tools to be used for kind of enforcement of non-complying uses. So that's kind of recommendation one, is let's protect what we've got, enforce the existing standards within our local land, our land use, state land use laws. Recommendation two, and these sort of is a little more challenging because it's how to restore existing habitat. And we sort of fundamentally believe, and I think everybody around the roundtable, from tribes to agricultural users to local governments, fundamentally believe that 90% of this improvement can be gained by using voluntary incentives, working collaboratively with property owners, with agricultural users, with local governments to develop functional and effective voluntary incentive programs to encourage protection or restoration of riparian corridors. So that's what that's what recommendation two is about. And we really feel like recommendation two is going to do the bulk of the work in these recommendations. One of the first key strategies we had to land on recommendation two is this going to be a statewide sort of requirement, or are we going to look at this more at a kind of watershed by watershed regional approach? It was pretty much unanimity among the roundtable users that regional approach, that watershed approach, was the right approach. We've got a lot of variation among the watersheds in the state in terms of what uses are impactful, what the state of the salmon is, what the needs of the salmon are, and what the needs of the agricultural community and other users are. So we landed pretty quickly on a watershed-based approach. In terms of how that watershed-based approach is implemented, there has been a lot of work done watershed to watershed on what salmon need within these watersheds amongst the state. There's also, in some instances, been a good deal of work on what's needed for agriculture, irrigators, and others. We want to make sure that we're building off of that good work that's been done and not dragging folks through more process just for the sake of process. So we envision that these watershed strategies will be implemented on a watershed by watershed basis through the group that makes the most sense in that watershed. And it'll likely may require some augmentation of that group to make sure all of the interests in the watershed are being represented. In some places, we think that'll be the lead salmon entity that's been working on salmon restoration in those watersheds, and they may need to bring in additional stakeholders like agricultural users. In some instances, we saw in Chelan County, they've got a very effective voluntary stewardship program. That's probably the logical place to get started with the implementation of this watershed approach. And then in some places, there's kind of a unique conglomeration of interests, like Yakima Basin, where we've got the Yakima Basin Integrated Plan that brings together all of those users already in a functional group. And we think that group can be used to implement these watershed by watershed approaches. So the key is making sure that there's a group within that watershed, augmenting an existing group or creating a new one if you have to, that looks at includes all of those stakeholders in strategies, collaborative strategies to restore riparian habitat. Those watershed groups are going to be charged. Our recommendation is that they're charged with developing plans that both protect salmon through a collaborative process, but also ensure the viability of agriculture in those watersheds. So the plan and the recommendations are very clear. They need to do both protect and restore salmon habitat while working collaboratively with other users and preserving the viability of agriculture. The plans are also designed exclusively to be based on meaningful voluntary incentive programs. So these aren't regulatory plans. They're going to be incentive programs that are targeted toward the watershed. And again, one of the keys to this recommendation is funding. And we've heard that often from all of the users, that one of the challenges over the last 20 years of salmon restoration is that we've had existing voluntary programs that have just not been adequately funding. And if you adequately fund robust voluntary programs, you'll get participation that can change the trajectory. And so that's kind of what we're looking at in this recommendation, is funding significant, robust voluntary incentive programs. Those programs will also set concrete goals. We have it recommended on a 3-year basis that, what are they can be a variety of things: miles of stream that's restored, acres of riparian habitat restored, but setting real concrete goals that can be monitored, and you can see how the watershed is doing in meeting those goals. And then having an adaptive management process that if those watersheds aren't meeting those goals, what do you do? What's the next steps to try to ensure that those watersheds are meeting those goals? So that's kind of the overview of what we're aiming for in recommendation 2. As you can see from the document, there's a lot more detail in there, simplifying the application process for grants, what elements to monitor for, how to look at agricultural viability. You can take a look at those details, and we're still working through some of those details, but that's kind of an overview of recommendation 2. Moving to recommendation 3, and this has been really one of the most challenging issues that we've been charged with both since we started this a year and a half ago. The legislature has given us the charge of establishing a compensation or regulatory program that kicks in when those voluntary programs are not meeting their established goals. We've done a lot of thinking about this. The draft of recommendation 3 that went over a month ago really focused on what we called a targeted acquisition program. So our recommendation was that in those instances where you've got a watershed that has developed collaboratively with all of the users a set of goals concrete goals and objectives, they're still not meeting those goals. They've tried adaptive management to meet those goals. They're still not getting there. Going through and determining if there are properties that are not participating in the voluntary programs that are critical to restoration of salmon in that watershed, to use a targeted acquisition program using eminent domain to essentially purchase at fair market value an interest in that property that allows for protection and restoration of that area. That purchase would be as limited an interest as possible, potentially a conservation easement. It would be purchased at fair market value. We see this as a very limited approach. And I think everybody around the table feels like adequately funded and adequate voluntary programs are gonna be able to do most of the work, and we're not gonna need to rely on one of these backstop programs. So that's kind of what we proposed in our initial recommendation number 3. We heard a lot of pushback on that in the discussions we've had since we made that recommendation. There are a lot of folks around the roundtable that want to use a regulatory approach first and have suggested various regulatory approaches. We've been reluctant to promote a regulatory approach in our recommendations in large for a number of reasons, but one of them is we feel like any regulatory approach is going to immediately raise implications on regulatory takings that are just going to increase acrimony and lead to delays in implementation of good projects. It's just going to put you back into that litigation mode. So we've sort of have historically shied away from that, from recommending a regulatory approach, and moved. It's kind of focused more on a first voluntary and then compulsory acquisition program. I don't know where that's going to land in terms of the sentiment of the group. We anticipate that our meetings on Monday and Tuesday are going to spend a lot of time diving into that, a lot of time talking about potential regulatory approaches, and we're hoping for sort of robust dialogue when we're sitting in a room face to face to kind of tackle those issues, because it is probably the most divisive issue that we're dealing with within the roundtable group, and it's the hardest needle to thread, but we're trying to do that. So that's that recommendation number 3. Finally, moving to recommendation number 4. That is sort of the what to do in the interim. What we've recommended in the last legislative session, I think it was actually the 2023 legislative session, there was a funding program set up that sent $25 million to the Conservation Commission for Riparian Habitat Protection, and an additional $25 million to the Governor Salmon Recovery Office for riparian habitat restoration. Both of those, the Conservation Commission put out some interim guidance, is working on permanent guidance for the expenditure of those funds. We've also the Salmon Recovery Office has implemented guidance for the expenditure of those funds. What we're recommending is keep funding those programs while over the next year or 2 that it takes to develop these watershed approaches. We think that those are good. That we can't lose 2 years while these approaches are being developed. We think the approaches that we've laid out in these recommendations are the way to get to a more robust salmon enhancement, but in the interim, we should robustly fund those programs that have newly been stood up, and we would recommend, I think, significant funding in excess of that $25 million per program. So that's our recommendation on what to do in the interim. I'll pause there and see if Peter has anything to add on that kind of overview run through of the recommendations, and then, as Mike said, we can open up for questions.
No, I think that was a great summary, Billy. I know there was one question already, where can you access the document? I posted a link to the OFM website in the chat for folks to grab that, but I don't have anything to add. And I think we're just through our 20 to 30 minutes here, Mike. So let's turn it over to you to see if there are questions.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you both for that great overview. I appreciate it. Folks on the call, you're welcome to ask questions. You can use the Q&A function that you can find at the bottom of your screen to type in your question. While we wait for some audience questions to come in, I have a couple here that I'd like to ask. And Billy, you touched on this, but I'd like for you to expand on it a little bit further. So the statute directed you to create recommendations on either a regulatory scheme or a compensation style program. You've landed on the compensation style program. So I'm wondering if you can maybe unpack your reasoning a little bit on why you're choosing compensation style schemes over a straight up regulatory scheme.
Great question, Mike. Yeah, we've given a great deal of thought to this, and I think our or maybe hampered by our legal backgrounds on this. We had a really good, and we did have a really good working group presentation on kind of regulatory takings law and where that line is. And Peter and I in our practices have dealt with that a lot. From our perspective, that sort of regulatory takings line is a really hard, particularly when you start talking about regulating existing uses and then going an additional step and saying, we're not just going to tell you, what you can and can't do with this piece of your property, but we're going to also require some affirmative action like planting, it is a very property by property specific approach that you need to look at and see if you're tripping into a regulatory taking when you're putting that on people's properties. So that's a arduous, combative, and litigation kind of heavy approach. And so that's kind of one of the reasons. The second reason is, it's sort of I know fairness is a tough in this realm because people have different sort of perspective on fairness. But the good thing about a sort of compulsory acquisition program or use of eminent domain is it requires paying fair market value. If you want to use that property for a public use and benefit, you need to pay the property owner fair market value for that taking of the property, and doing that affirmatively as opposed to putting a regulatory program on the property that didn't necessarily provide any compensation felt like a more acceptable approach, I'll say. So I think those are the two biggest reasons we landed on the sort of targeted compensation program. Peter, I don't know if you've got anything to add to that.
Yeah, I think the other thing that I would add to that, agreeing with all of that and agreeing that those are the main drivers of where we got there. But in addition, we were really thinking of this in the context of the voluntary approaches at the watershed level being funded well enough to succeed. And the scenario that the regulatory, as we came to that conclusion, the scenario in which any regulatory action or a compensation action would occur after all of that voluntary work happened. And inevitably, in that scenario, you'd be picking a particular piece of property that through that process sort of rose to being the essential factor for salmon recovery happening in that watershed. That's a very, very narrow set of circumstances, and sort of a heavy regulatory program to try and address that very narrow circumstances is inconsistent with pushing the voluntary approach. And in the end, as Billy points out, if you're in that scenario, any kind of regulatory approach is either going to end up in a long period of litigation or straight out decision to sell or buy. And if it's not to sell and we have to do something here, we felt like you would necessarily be in an eminent domain scenario, if not in unconstitutional takings, if you tried to do a regulatory approach. And one of the things that we have heard from the roundtables all along is that everybody wants to solve this problem without delay because everybody cares about salmon. We've heard that from you and Farm Bureau members consistently through the program, because I think in part there's a perception that you don't, and we know you do. And two, it was, so let's take action quickly. 10 years of litigation on each piece of property over regulatory takings is not a quick way to solve this problem.
Right. One of the biggest criticisms against the Lorraine-Loomis Act and the other buffer bills that we've seen prior to that and since then is this concept of it being a takings. So I would hope that when you do your final set of recommendations, and I'm expecting you're going to have a lot of narrative in addition to the recommendations, that you get into a little bit of your reasoning why you landed on the compensation style program rather than the regulatory style. I think that narrative would be important because a lot of the stakeholder groups did make that claim that it is clearly a takings, but there was some pushback from the other side on whether it really was or not. So
yeah, we're not going to opine whether it is or we're not. We're just basically say we're going to skip to the end and get to where you're more likely than not to be.
Fair enough.
We've a lot of experience, but we're not judges.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
We will explain. I think it is fair to say, anybody in this field, you're going to implicate regulatory takings concerns, and that is going to be a business.
Yeah, agreed.
So you've got a bunch of questions from Keith and Bree in the chat.
Yeah. So from Keith, what is the targeted buffer width that is being sought?
So I think what we've said, we've leaned into the WDFW Volume 1 of the riparian guidance, which articulates sort of the functions and values of riparian habitat. I think the buffers in there are the site potential tree height buffer. With our recommendation number 2, what we've said is if you can attain that, that should be the goal. That's what the guidance recommends. But we also recognize that as a practical matter, when you've got existing uses up against those, kind of the riparian areas, that's not going to be practically attainable in a lot of instances. And in those instances where it's not attainable, and I think that's a lot of places where there are existing uses, the watershed group would determine what is the sort of appropriate buffer. I think it could be on a project by project basis. That's a little bit what happens with RCO's program right now, is they, take a scientific look at a particular project and restoration strategy and say, does the proposed buffer here provide adequate habitat value to justify the sort of cost of the incentive program? I think they could do that, or they could set some watershed-based criteria for what those kind of buffers in those instances where you've got an existing impediment to full riparian buffers, what makes sense in that watershed. So that's kind of where our head has been on it. I think we've again leaned into that WDFW Volume 1 manual because it talks about what the kind of where you get, it's got these curves that show where you get what sort of levels of values. I'm not a scientist, English major and then lawyer. So, but it talks about where you start getting those values. And I think there's some recognition around the table that you get a lot of those values before you get to site. But yes, you get full 100% at site potential tree height, but you get pretty significant values ahead of that. And we would envision that those watershed groups would work collaboratively to try to come up with what some of those strategies would be.
And just to give a little sense of, so the volume, those WDFW volumes recommend anywhere between 1 foot. I don't know if they go that low, but they go all the way up to 250 feet site potential tree height. Is that correct?
I think that's right. Yeah. And just to be clear, it's only we've really leaned into volume. We had a lot of discussion on Volume 1 versus Volume 2. Volume 1 is the science document that says the science behind the buffers. Volume 2 is the management recommendations. And Mike, you'll see this. You've pointed this out a couple of times, as have a couple of your members. We were a little sloppy in our handling of that in the draft recommendations, and we're working on cleaning that up. We're really leaning into Volume 1, the science document, as the tool that should be used to determine what appropriate buffers are. Volume 2, the management recommendations, is a helpful and important tool, but it's a guidance document that is not necessarily it says at the outset it's not the best available science that needs to be used. So we said you should think about that as you're thinking about other things, but the document you should really rely on is the science-based document that it shows where you get those values.
Yeah, great, thank you. Another audience question: can it really be called voluntary if there is a regulatory backstop?
It is one of the challenges that you land on with a regulatory approach. We probably should have articulated. It's a great question. Articulated that as one of the reasons that we did not go down the regulatory route and went down the sort of voluntary acquisition or the eminent domain route. I think it is problematic for some of the program. I recognize it's problematic for some of the programs to have. If you've got to do it from a regulatory perspective, then it ain't voluntary, and you're not going to be able to get some of your voluntary, you're not going to be able to access some of those voluntary programs. I'll say we've been clear, I think, or tried to be clear, and we'll continue to be clear in our recommendations that the funding that we're suggesting coming from the state not be bound up in that issue of what is and is not voluntary, that we not necessarily get tied up in that. If there's a regulatory program, it shouldn't in play, it shouldn't be funded. But it's an issue that we're cognizant of, and it's part of why we're one of the pieces of our reluctance to go toward a regulatory approach.
Right, and the state already has eminent domain authority currently.
Correct.
I don't know if I don't think they've ever used it. I know some of the local entities have. Sound Transit probably has. I don't know if the state has ever used eminent domain.
Not in this context. In transportation context, I have.
It's used for roads and highways pretty frequently.
Right. So that brings up another question. What happens if funding for the voluntary incentive programs doesn't materialize? Right? You have all these performance measures that you're going to be looking at every 3 years or so on a cycle. And if funding for those programs doesn't happen, what's the property owner supposed to do if there's no sort of this quote voluntary program in the front end? They're obviously not going to meet those performance measures, presumably, if they're not participating in those programs that weren't funded, but you're still measuring, and there's still this threat of eminent domain at the end of it. What's the property owner supposed to do?
Yeah,
So
we've actually.
I guess. Oh, you want to
let
take
me
it?
Let me just dive in because that was a topic that Amanda and I, our other partner who's working on these, were diving into on our kind of revised recommendations. I think it's a really good point. It came up in the working group discussions. What we're contemplating right now, and again, this is kind of draft recommendations that we're kind of thinking through, is on that regulatory / compensation backstop, whatever we come up with there, that there should be some carve out for instances that are beyond property owners' control, like lack of funding, like, the plantings fail because there's a drought. I mean, there's a lot of a lot of circumstances that are beyond the landowner's control, and we agree that there should be a carve out for those instances, and in part because our perspective is the state needs to fund these programs if they want to meet with success. That's the path to success. So that's kind of our thinking. Sorry for jumping in front of you, Peter. It was just top of my mind.
That's good. That's good.
Yeah, I mean, we all have experience with the legislature funding and not funding programs and even sweeping funds for other purposes later on. So it does leave a lot of uncertainty going forward of whether the legislature actually funds these programs or not.
Yeah. And so for me, that is a significant part of the implementation conversation, which was the only thing I was going to add to Billy. If you have to take all of these recommendations together, because they design a framework and a suite of recommendations that if they are done and work together, they have a chance at working. But if you pull in pieces apart, it all collapses on itself. And we're right back where we are.
Okay, another audience question. Developed lakefront properties are a significant contributor to habitat or lack thereof. Are these properties going to be subject to the same rules? If not, why?
Yeah.
Yes.
They will. And I think that one of the things that we're working with too is to and it's sort of, you've seen it, Mike, in some of the recommendations, and it's still very much at play kind of where it lands, but we're thinking about how to, even in those instances where you've got, let's take it a step further than the lakefront developed property and go to the urban watersheds that have skyscrapers next to riparian corridors. That there should be some recognition that part of the problem needs to carry its fair share as well, in some sort of tax or other mechanism to you're not going to tear down skyscrapers necessarily, but you can sort of create a funding source that then goes into funding programs that create habitat elsewhere where it's more feasible. So we see that, and that's something that's been hammered on by, I think, everybody in the room, is that that, much to the chagrin of the Washington Association of Cities lobbyist Carl, but that we've got to find a way to make everybody pay their fair share. This isn't just an ag versus salmon issue.
Right. All right. Let's see. Does there need to be a new watershed program if the voluntary program that agriculture supported is already working?
No. Go ahead, Peter.
No, but those programs need to have the groups agreeing, and there are places where that has happened that they are being successful. So if you have that, nope, you don't need to do anything new.
I have a question. What has been the reaction from lawmakers on your preliminary recommendations? Have you reached out to lawmakers? Have you heard from any of them yet?
I'm in the process. I was writing this morning just before we got started, setting up a briefing with the group of legislators that we've briefed once before on where we are. That'll happen here in third week of June, probably. We have heard nothing from them, even though they have received the recommendation. So they haven't taken action on their own. But I'm hosting a briefing, and that next budget proviso, as you know, Mike, and I alluded to this, the legislators chose not to include themselves in the groups that met in the first two. They have included themselves in the next round, and so I expect that there will be a lot of, in the early days, educating of those legislators on what the recommendations say and where we are with us and participants from the roundtable, and that's when I anticipate we'll get that reaction.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
The
Let's
thing
see.
I'll add to that, Mike, just real quick, is that if you
Yeah.
look at the front matter on the recommendations, we tried to be very clear that these are preliminary recommendations. We don't have a consensus. They're not legislative language. We're really working with the group and envision these will change by the time of our final report. So I think that may be why we're not hearing much from the legislatures. We really telegraphed, hold on. This is the first step, but let's wait till you see our final product.
Couple new questions have come in here. Let's see. How do you see these recommendations being interfaced with the critical areas ordinance inside a Growth Management Act?
So we see recommendation 1 as largely being implemented through critical areas ordinances. That's a tool that would be in the toolbox, not necessarily changing any of the Growth Management Act requirements for critical areas ordinance. We just think it's making sure those ordinances also include riparian and providing some guidance on how to include riparian habitat. Recommendations 2 and 3, I don't think we see as really, or 4 for that matter, is really implicating the GMA critical areas ordinances, the voluntary programs, targeted acquisition. I mean, there are regulatory approaches certainly under recommendation 3 that could, but where we sit right now with these recommendations, I don't think they would implicate that.
And this is for, probably put your lawyer hat on for this one then. Does fair market value compensate farmers for a lifetime of revenue loss? Is that fair compensation if it becomes a mandate and not a choice?
Let me take that one.
Please.
I will put my lawyer hat on and say I am not an appraiser, and I always have appraisers do that analysis. I have had great success in voluntary transactions, having appraisers identify that future revenue stream as part of the current fair market value, but it's ultimately going to be based on that situation. To the extent that there's disagreement, the condemnation process provides for opportunity to argue and debate what goes into that fair market value determination, and it's very much a case-by-case scenario.
Yeah. All right, let's start wrapping up here. I'll take this last question, which will, I think, segue into our finishing up here. Is there a timeline being targeted for implementation? And then I'll add on to that. Could you talk a little bit more about next steps and when you, so the final recommendations come out, what happens after the final recommendations come out, and maybe talk a little bit more about the new proviso and how you foresee that unfolding over the next 6 months.
Timeline is to put the report out at the end of the month. The second phase or the third phase of this is something that we have started to think about, Mike. One of the challenges of working under budget provisos is we only have sort of certain parameters with which we can operate, and that new budget proviso doesn't actually start until July 1 of next year. We don't even have a contract, so arguably we couldn't be we may not be the consultant for that. I think we're going to be. So we're beginning to frame that. We're going to talk on Tuesday a little bit about that with the group, because we want the group sort of to help us frame that, which is what we did at the end of the last one coming into this one. That proviso has us doing that work and filing a report by November 15th of 2024 in terms of what the implementation concepts are. So I think the answer to the specific question of timeline for implementation, that'll be determined between July 1 and November 15th of this year.
And we'll likely see legislation in the 2025 session. I would guess. You can't speculate.
Yeah, I mean, I think to the there's no question that implementation will require at least funding. So I think that's if our recommendations are accepted, yes, you would absolutely at least see some funding recommendations. The only thing I'll add to what Peter said is I think we have about a 1.5 to 2 year process envisioned in recommendation 2 for developing the watershed plans.
Yep.
So to the extent those are funded and that accepted, that would kind of go over a course of, I think it's to January 2027, Peter, I want to say. Yeah.
Are you going to include a dollar amount in your recommendations?
No.
Although we will include. Yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Billy.
We will include the fact, we're going to write up some narrative around the historic underfunding and how critical funding is, and give some examples of what really robust riparian funding would look like. I don't think we're gonna have a specific number, but we've dealt in other watersheds. Peter's done a lot of work in Yakima Basin. I've done a lot of work down in Louisiana where folks are putting really serious funding into some of these projects. So we have a sense of what that is, and it's pretty significantly in excess of what we've seen to date.
Yeah, probably hundreds of billions of dollars, if not in the B's.
That's what we've said to each other, Mike. So
Okay.
one other thing that I will say about what could happen next, you can always look backwards to gain information on what could happen next. In 2022, we filed a report and a bunch of bills went forward, none of which had really anything to do with our recommendations. So it's entirely possible that could happen again. Our hope is that the way this process has gone, and it's, it had 4 months of maturity before that last scenario happened. And so it wasn't surprising that that's what happened in the legislature. Our hope is this has gone on for a while and we have another 4 or 5 months before everybody gets really focused on starting to throw legislative language, and it can change the dynamic so that if there are budget conversations, if there are policy bill conversations, at a minimum, we will have a group of people that legislators could reach out to and start conversations instead of dropping a bill, as you articulated before, unstakeholdered at all. There's no bill being stakeholdered right now because we're not writing that, but we're doing the hard work of getting people's voices heard and their concerns and ideas put on the table. And hopefully that will change what may happen in the legislature, but we don't control that.
Yeah, thank you. Billy, Peter, thank you so much for agreeing to participate this morning. I greatly appreciate it. You have an incredibly difficult task in front of you. I recognize that. I think the entire stakeholder group recognizes that. The diverse agendas that are part of that group make it nearly impossible to thread that needle. But you're trying, and I think you're getting close. So I appreciate the time and effort of your firm, and especially of you two for participating and trying to make that work.
Thank you for the opportunity. Really appreciate the opportunity to kind of explain ourselves is really important, and just want to emphasize what Peter said at the outset, Mike. Your involvement has been really robust, important, and helpful, and thoughtful. So we appreciate the Farm Bureau's kind of encouraging your continued robust involvement in the process.
Yeah, thank you. All right, folks. Thanks, everybody. We'll go ahead and adjourn the call now. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.